Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a deeply emotional story, one that follows Jack and Tu Tien as they struggle to rebuild their lives after a devastating storm, only to uncover a darker truth hiding behind the calm. It's a story of love, loss, and the courage to face the shadows that linger even when the skies are clear. If you enjoy stories filled with heart and humanity, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next chapter of Jack and Tu Tien's journey. The early morning mist draped itself over the quiet town like a weary ghost, lingering after the storm's fury had passed. Jack stood by the window of his small office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, voice low but edged with tension. "Ms. Huan, prepare the full set of documents for the bridge project," he said, his tone clipped, efficient. "We need to assess the structural damage before noon, and make sure the contractors are ready." Outside, the remnants of destruction whispered through the wind, broken branches scattered like bones across the soaked ground, roofs caved in, and the faint echo of hammers rebuilding what the storm had devoured. Jack's brow furrowed as he watched a group of farmers trudging through the mud, their carts heavy with ruined crops. He could almost feel their despair seeping into the air. His bridges were meant to connect lives, not watch them drown. He exhaled, a long, weary breath. The storm had left more than physical scars. It had unsettled something deeper, something that refused to fade. Tu Tien's case still hung over him like a shadow that even daylight couldn't pierce. Every time he tried to focus on work, her trembling voice returned to him. "Jack, they followed me again." He grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the street. The air still smelled of wet earth and fear. By the time he reached the cafe, the sun was struggling to break through a quilt of gray clouds. The sign above the door flickered, Phuong Nam Cafe, its light half dead, half alive. Inside, the faint aroma of bitter coffee mixed with damp wood. The room was nearly empty, save for two men seated in the corner, their uniforms crisp despite the humidity. Police officers. They noticed him instantly. One raised a hand slightly. "Jack, have a seat." Jack slid into the chair opposite them. The table was narrow. He could hear the uneven rhythm of his own breathing. "About Tu Tien," the older officer began, his voice low, cautious. "We've caught two men. They confessed to the attack." Jack's eyes flickered. His fists clenched around the edge of the table. "Who hired them?" The officer hesitated, exchanging a glance with his partner. "That's the problem. There's someone else behind it. Someone we can't identify yet, but this wasn't random." Jack's pulse quickened. "You mean someone planned all of this?" The younger officer leaned forward. "Yes, we believe the mastermind has connections, possibly within your company." The words hit like a thunderclap. Jack's stomach knotted. His company? His own people. He thought of the bridge project, of the contracts, the rivalries, the jealous eyes. It could be anyone. He stared down at his coffee, its surface trembling slightly with each beat of his heart. "If that's true," he murmured, "then this isn't about the accident anymore." The older officer nodded. "It's more than that, Jack. You need to stay alert and keep this quiet, for now." Jack nodded slowly, though his thoughts were already racing ahead. He could see Tu Tien's face, the calm she tried to maintain, the gentle smile that masked 1,000 fractures. She had survived too much already. He couldn't let the darkness reach her again. "I'll cooperate," he said finally, his voice steady but hollow. "Just tell me what I need to do." The officers rose, their expressions grave. "Stay close to her," one said, "and watch your back." They left behind the faint smell of rain-soaked leather and authority. Jack remained seated, staring at the cup between his hands. The cafe was quiet, except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. Each second sounded like a reminder of how little time he had to protect the people he loved. Through the window, the world blurred, half mist, half reflection. He saw his own face, drawn and pale, and behind it, the faint shadow of Tu Tien tending her small garden in the countryside, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back. He could almost hear her humming while watering the seedlings, trying to rebuild a life from the ruins of loss. He stood abruptly, leaving coins on the table. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a sound that sliced through the silence like a warning bell. Outside, the wind carried the smell of damp soil and smoke from nearby fields. He pulled his jacket tighter, eyes sharp with resolve. Whatever storm awaited him next, it would not find him unprepared. By noon, the sky had brightened, but the air was still heavy with humidity and dread. Jack drove toward the edge of town, where the narrow road wound through fields battered by the flood. Small homes leaned against each other, their walls patched with tin and hope. He stopped by a roadside stall, buying 2 bundles of lotus flowers. Tu Tien loved them. She said they reminded her that beauty could rise even from the mud. The road curved into the village, where a small house with a faded blue roof came into view. Smoke curled gently from the kitchen chimney. When he entered, the sound of sizzling oil greeted him. The scent of fried fish filled the air. Tu Tien stood by the stove, her apron dusted with flour, eyes bright, but carrying a sadness that no storm could wash away. "You're home early," she said softly, turning to him. Jack smiled faintly, brushing dirt from his sleeves. "The site's still a mess, but I needed to see you." He moved beside her, reaching for an apron. "Let me help." Together, they folded rice paper around fillings, rolling spring rolls in silence that felt almost sacred. Each motion, each glance carried unspoken comfort. "You've been working too much," she murmured. "You look tired." He smiled. "And you've been worrying too much." She paused, gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight caught on the glass jars of pickled vegetables. "Sometimes I dream that everything will be calm again, that I can just bake cakes and sell them at the market, that people will come not to question, but to smile." Jack looked at her, his heart tightening. That day will come. But his voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear he carried. The door creaked open. Fuang's father stepped in, his hands calloused, his face etched with the calm wisdom of the countryside. "Ah, the smell of fried fish! You city people cook better than us now," he joked, sitting down with a grin. Tu Tien laughed softly, wiping her hands. "Uncle, you always know when lunch is ready." He watched the two of them with quiet satisfaction. "Jack," he said after a pause, "you've done good by her. I thank you." Jack shook his head. "She's the one helping me stay human." The old man's eyes softened. "You both have been through hell, but remember, storms end, even the worst of them." They began to eat, chopsticks clinking gently against the bowls. For a moment, laughter filled the air, fragile but real. Yet beneath it, unease coiled like a silent serpent. When Tu Tien mentioned her lost child, the air shifted, her voice faltered, the clatter of chopsticks ceased. Phuong's father's expression hardened, a storm flickering behind his eyes. If Tui and Tien had any part in that, they'll pay, he muttered. Jack's hand found Tu Tien's under the table, squeezing gently. "Let's not think about them now," he whispered. But the promise in his touch was clear. He would not let them escape justice. Outside, a low rumble of thunder echoed from afar, though the sky was clear. It was as if the storm had left a piece of itself behind, lurking, waiting. Jack looked at Tu Tien's face lit by the golden lamplight, fragile yet unbroken, and knew that peace was only temporary. Because somewhere, out there, in the fog of the unknown, the mastermind was still watching. The afternoon faded into a quiet stillness, the kind that arrives after too much has been said, yet nothing is resolved. The storm clouds had drifted away, leaving behind air thick with memory. Jack stood outside the small house, leaning against the wooden fence, eyes tracing the path where the horizon met the rice fields. The sound of cicadas rose and fell in the distance, steady as breath. Inside, Tu Tien washed the dishes in silence, her movements rhythmic, calm, but her mind was far away. The faint murmur of water against porcelain was the only sound between them, soft yet haunting. Jack turned back, stepping into the doorway. The smell of fried fish lingered, mixed with the faint sweetness of lotus blossoms resting on the table. Phuong's father sat near the window, sipping tea. His eyes, usually full of quiet humor, had darkened. "Jack," he began slowly, "I've lived long enough to know when trouble doesn't end. The men who attacked Tu Tien, if their leader is still out there, he won't stop." Jack nodded, his face drawn. "I know. The police said the same. They think it might be someone tied to the company." The old man's brow furrowed. "Your company? Then the danger's closer than you think." "I've thought about that," Jack replied. "But if it's true, I can't run. I have to find out who's behind it." Tu Tien dried her hands and turned, her voice steady but soft. "Jack, what if it's not about you at all? What if it's about me?" Jack froze. Her words cut through the air like a blade. Tu Tien looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "What if someone wants to bury the truth about what happened to my son?" The memory of that night, screeching tires, shattered glass, her screams, flashed across her mind like lightning. She closed her eyes, trying to hold the pieces together. Jack stepped forward, his hand resting on her shoulder. "No," he said firmly. "You've suffered enough. Whoever's behind this, they'll face what they've done." Phuong's father leaned back, his expression unreadable. The truth always rises, but sometimes it burns everything in its path. For a while, no one spoke. The only sound was the kettle hissing softly on the stove. That evening, after Phuong's father had gone back to his farm, the house grew quiet again. The village lights flickered like tired stars across the fields. Tu Tien sat by the table, mending a torn sleeve. Her hands moved with patience, though her heart felt heavy. Jack returned from the shed, the faint scent of engine oil clinging to him. "I fixed the generator," he said, setting down a wrench. "If the power cuts again, you'll have light." She smiled faintly. "You always think of everything." "Not everything," he admitted, sitting across from her. "There are things I wish I could undo." Her eyes lifted to meet his, gentle yet searching. We can't change the past, Jack. We can only carry it differently. The lamplight between them flickered, painting their faces in soft gold. Jack's gaze lingered on her. A woman who had lost a child, faced danger, and still managed to smile through it all. Her strength both comforted and frightened him. Tu Tien, he said quietly, if things get worse, promise me you'll go stay with my mother in the city. It's safer there. She shook her head. This is my home now. I can't keep running from shadows. Jack wanted to argue, but her eyes, steady, calm, unyielding, told him she had already survived storms greater than fear itself. He sighed, rubbing his temples. I'll build a new fence tomorrow. Stronger, taller, just in case. She smiled, though her heart twisted. You think a fence can stop fate? Maybe not, he said, but it might buy us time. The next morning broke with a quiet that felt unnatural. Mist rolled over the fields again, thick and low. Jack was already outside, hammer in hand, driving nails into the new wooden posts. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat against the still air. Tu Tien watched from the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her eyes followed every motion, each swing of his arm. Beneath her calm, unease gnawed at her chest. Suddenly, a motorcycle engine roared in the distance. It grew louder, closer, until a black motorbike skidded to a halt near the gate. Two men dismounted, helmets reflecting the pale morning light. Jack straightened, his jaw tightening. "Can I help you?" One of the men pulled off his helmet. It was Officer Bin, one of the investigators from the cafe. His expression was grim. "Jack, we need to talk." Tu Tien's breath caught. The officer glanced at her before lowering his voice. "One of the suspects escaped custody last night." Jack's grip tightened around the hammer. "What? How?" "We don't know," Bin replied, "but we found a note in his cell. It said, 'The bridge will fall before the truth does.'" Tu Tien's hand flew to her chest. "The bridge project?" Jack's mind raced. The bridge, his bridge, stood at the heart of everything. Contracts, rivalries, politics. It wasn't just concrete and steel, it was money, power, pride. Bin continued, "We believe whoever orchestrated the attack on Tu Tien is planning something bigger, something tied to that project." Jack felt a chill crawl down his spine. "Then it's not just about revenge." "No," the officer said grimly. "It's about control." The words hung in the air like smoke. By noon, the officers had left, and the house felt smaller, heavier. Jack sat at the table, papers spread before him. Blueprints, permits, contracts, all suddenly suspect. He couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere within those pages lay the key to everything. Tu Tien poured tea, her hands trembling. "Jack," she whispered, "maybe it's better to walk away. Let it go before it destroys you." He looked up, his eyes fierce but weary. "If I walk away, they win, and they'll come for us again." She wanted to protest, but his voice carried the weight of a man who'd already made peace with his fate. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. The curtain swayed, brushing against the table, as if the house itself could sense the coming storm. Jack gathered the documents and slid them into a folder. "I'll go to the city tomorrow," he said. "Meet with Ms. Huan. See if she's heard anything unusual." Tu Tien nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "Be careful, Jack." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I'll come back before nightfall, I promise." She smiled, but her heart didn't believe him. That night, The field shimmered under a pale moon. The rebuilt fence stood tall, its wooden edges catching the light like silent sentinels. Inside, Tu Tien sat by the window, a candle burning beside her. The soft glow lit her face, revealing lines carved by loss and resilience. She picked up her rosary, whispering a prayer, not just for Jack, but for forgiveness, for peace, for the souls of those who had wronged her. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, then silence fell again. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint sound of an approaching vehicle. Tu Tien's eyes flicked toward the road, her breath shallow. The candle flame trembled. A figure passed the gate, slow, deliberate, watching. She rose, her heart pounding, and moved toward the window. But when she looked again, the road was empty. Only the sound of the wind remained. Tu Tien stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. Somewhere, in the fog-covered distance, thunder rumbled again. Not from the sky, but from the earth, deep and unseen. And in that moment, she knew. The storm was far from over.